Chapter 33 is looking at the Great Depression, but through a new lens, through FDR's New Deal. This is his domestic plan for fixing the Great Depression from 1933 to 1939. Now, to start with, remember, the Republicans are in a really bad way in 1932. Everyone blamed Herbert Hoover for the Great Depression, etc. So the Democrats could pretty much have picked anyone they wanted to and probably have gotten them elected. So during the Democratic National Convention, when FDR was actually nominated by the Democrats, he promised the American people a quote-unquote New Deal, or a new way to fix the economy. This becomes the catchphrase for all of his domestic programs, all of the legislative things that get pushed through during his presidency aimed at fixing the Depression. Now, what the New Deal is, these are basically a bunch of different legislative acts, and there's not exactly a whole lot of forethought behind it. Basically, they're trying to throw whatever they can at the Great Depression to try to bring about an end to the Great Depression. Herbert Hoover, obviously for the Republicans, and FDR brings with him his group of unofficial advisors. These are his brain trust. These are his speechwriters, etc., during not only his campaign, but then later on when he is actually crafting New Deal policies. And in a landslide victory, and if you remember back 4 short years before how Herbert Hoover had won in a landslide victory, FDR won by a large margin in 1932. We also see with the election of Franklin Roosevelt in 1932 what is created known as the New Deal Coalition, and to some degree this still exists today within the Democratic Party. Basically, this is a new group of voters who are going to vote primarily for the Democratic Party. People like African Americans are going to shift from voting for the Republicans like they had done previously for the Party of Lincoln, and now for the Democrats. Farmers out west and in the South. The solid Democratic South voting for the Democrats. And also labor unions make up the New Deal coalition. But so FDR is elected in 1932. The problem is that Herbert Hoover still remains president until March of 1933, and during this lame duck period, the economy gets worse and worse and worse, and there's nothing anyone can do about it because the Democrats haven't taken office yet. Here you see the electoral map for 32 and the new president, Franklin Roosevelt. So FDR really was going to hit the ground running because he really didn't have time to waste now that he is inaugurated in March of 1933. And in his inaugural address, he very famously said, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Basically, the idea here is that we've created this terrible economy, and we're exacerbating this terrible economy because we're afraid to do the things that need to be done to fix this economy. He is going to attack the Great Depression head on, throwing whatever pieces of legislation he can at the economy. Add to that the fact that he has a Democratic Congress that have ridden the FDR train into office. They were willing to pass anything that FDR wanted during his first term in office pretty much. So during FDR's first 100 days in office, he gets a lot of stuff passed aimed at trying to bring about an end to the Depression. He gains a lot of momentum, and like I said, there's not a lot of discussion because there's not a lot of opposition to FDR in Congress. They're willing to try anything because this is such a terrible economic downturn. And at the end of the day, historians looking back at the New Deal, his policy for ending the Depression, separated into the 3 R's: relief from unemployment, recovery of the economy, and reform of the institutions so this never happens again. This is us looking back at the time saying we're either trying to relieve unemployment, recover the economy, or reform the system so this doesn't happen again. Historians also divide the New Deal into what is known as the First New Deal or the Second New Deal. Primarily, the First New Deal pretty much is focusing on relief and recovery because that's necessary before reform can occur, which is mostly part of the Second New Deal. And like I said before, the president is given unprecedented powers during this time because Congress is just willing to allow him because he has some form of an idea. Now, it's not a concerted or a long-term goal. He's trying whatever he can. And the first thing to focus on is the banking system. People are so scared to put their money in banks anymore because so much money has already been lost. And if you put your money in a bank and it collapses the next day, there goes everything you've ever owned. And so people are pulling their money out of banks, which is only adding to the downfall of banks. Like a domino going across the country, banks are closing left and right. And this is only causing more stagnation of the economy. So on March 6th, almost immediately after FDR's inauguration, he called for a bank holiday to close and reorganize all the banks in the United States to stop them from failing, to give them a breather. And then on March 9th, Congress passed the Emergency Banking Relief Act. This gives the president the power to close down insolvent banks, reorganize them, and then reopen them once they are more economically sound. And with this is restoring some confidence in the system, because within 3 days, the president reopens 5,000 banks. People are starting to feel a little bit more secure. Things are starting to change. The government is doing something to address these problems. And in order to get people to back these new legislative agenda items that the president is putting forth, the president used what were known as fireside chats. Basically, he would go on the radio every couple of months and give an address to the American people. And the people would sit at home and listen on their radios. And the idea here is to ease their fears, to calm them down, so that people are more likely to then go put their money back in the banks again, to restore the confidence. Another piece of legislation passed aimed at banking reform is the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act. This is very important because it still affects us today. It does two things. First, it creates the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. The government, at this time in 1933, would insure all bank deposits up to $5,000. Today, it's obviously much more than that, but this is restoring confidence. I can take my money out from under the mattress where I've hidden it, put it in a bank, because I know even if that bank closes, my money is now insured, that the FDIC, aka the federal government, will pay me back if my bank closes. It also took the United States off the gold standard for a short amount of time. It called in all gold to be paid off at $35 an ounce, which is a lot more money than it was worth. And the idea here is to create inflation, so that there would be more money in circulation, and like we've talked about before, give those debtors relief, give them the opportunity to pay off some of their debt, and start adding to productivity again, because if there's physical cash in people's pockets, they're more likely to go out and spend it to get that economy flowing again. This is a short period of time. The U.S. did return to the gold standard in 1934, but only for international trade, and then later on a domestic level as well. Now, like I said, one of the goals of the New Deal is to end or to give relief from unemployment. In 1933, nationwide there was a 25% unemployment rate. In some states it was higher than that. For some racial groups like African Americans, it was much higher, that as high as 50%. And so the federal government, on an unprecedented level, is looking to get people back to work again, to prime that pump, to get the economy flowing again. And so multiple pieces of legislation were passed to get men back to work. One such example is the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. This was a very popular New Deal program at the time that gave about 3 million men jobs for the federal government. The CCC would hire these men to build public works projects, to build parks, to build roads, to build federal buildings, etc. And one of the requirements was that they had to send a portion of their check back home. The idea, get men back to work. Another piece of legislation passed with the New Deal is the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or FERA. Harry Hopkins was the administrator for FERA. And once again, the idea here is to relieve unemployment by giving $3 billion to states and local governments for them to create their own public works projects, or their own way to distribute that money to the regular people on a state and local wide basis. Also under FERA, though, they created a separate organization, the Civilian Works Administration, the CWA, once again giving temporary and seasonal jobs to men across the country. And then finally for this slide to talk about is the Work Progress Administration, or the WPA, in 1935. Once again, headed up by Harry Hopkins to give relief from unemployment. And the WPA, aside from building roads and bridges and things like that, it also employed artists and writers and actors because these people are obviously out of jobs as well. And by 1943, the WPA was actually the largest employer in the United States. Now, you might be thinking, all of these things sound exactly the same, and pretty much they are. It's not like FDR came into office thinking, okay, I have a very organized plan about how I'm going to fix this Great Depression. Pretty much his analogy was, our house is on fire. We have to do something to get rid of this Great Depression. We're going to try a piece of legislation, see if it works. If it doesn't, we'll move on to the next thing. And so the New Deal is very haphazard. It seems very redundant from a lot of people's perspectives, but at the same time, he's trying something. Here you see men working for the CCC, building a road. So like I said, there's a lot of opposition to FDR and his New Deal. And at the time, there are three major people that really exemplify this opposition to the New Deal. That most people could follow with one of these three people and be opposed to FDR at this time. First and foremost is a Catholic radio priest by the name of Father Charles Coughlin. Father Charles Coughlin was a fascist. He was an anti-Semitic preacher, which means anti-Jewish. And he linked the New Deal to this Jewish international money conspiracy. He called his plan social justice. He absolutely would have been a big supporter of Adolf Hitler once he comes to power. And so Father Coughlin, railing on his radio show, basically said that FDR is too linked in with the Jewish money conspiracy. And so he is the first major opponent of the New Deal. The second major opponent to the New Deal is a Democratic senator from Louisiana, Huey P. Long. His nickname was the Kingfish. He was a Democrat just like FDR, but he said, FDR, you're not going far enough. He wanted FDR to push for more socialistic programs, to take the government towards more of a socialistic background than he was going. And Huey Long's plan was called the Share Our Wealth Plan. And basically what he wanted to do was redistribute wealth in the United States through higher taxes. So tax the wealthy very, very high, and then redistribute that tax base to the lower classes. And his catchphrase was that every man is a king. And actually, Louisiana Senator Huey Long was probably FDR's biggest challenger for the 1936 election, except he was assassinated on the steps of the Louisiana State House. And last but not least was Dr. Francis Townsend. Dr. Francis Townsend was an elderly man, and he promoted what became known as the Townsend Plan. He said, the way to get this economy going again is to give $200 a month pensions to retirees every single month. $200 in 1933 is a crazy amount of money. But he said, we give this money to retirees. Number one, they're the hardest hit by the Depression because they can't work no matter what over the age of 65. But the catch is that they have to spend all of that money within the month. And the idea is to get the economy going with consumer spending. That if that $200 check has to be spent within that month, they're going to go out and buy stuff. And that's then going to create jobs. So these are the three major opposition people to FDR and the New Deal during the 1930s. And here you see Coughlin, Long, and Francis Townsend. Now, the focus of the New Deal is also on recovery of industry at this time, to get industry going again. And a major piece of legislation that was passed by Congress is the NIRA, the National Industrial Recovery Act. Now, before I go any further, you might notice that there are a lot of acronyms here. Many historians call the New Deal alphabet soup because there are so many letters just swimming around with each of these pieces of legislation. So anyway, back to the NIRA. The NIRA created the NRA, the National Recovery Administration. And the National Recovery Administration is supposed to be a voluntary organization, that an industry can voluntarily abide by the NRA's regulations. This was meant to create fair codes of competition, to set a minimum wage, to set maximum hours, and to allow the labor to have a right to collectively bargain. Now, once again, this is meant to be voluntary, that if your business wanted to abide by the NRA, you would abide by those regulations. And in return, you would be given a poster to hang up in your window that showed the blue eagle. The blue eagle was the symbol of the NRA. And the reason being was that a person looking to go to an industry or to use your business would be more likely to go to a Blue Eagle shop than a non-Blue Eagle shop, because the idea was that you were doing your part to help end this depression. Now, the reality was a lot of businesses joined the NRA, but a lot of them didn't actually uphold the NRA's regulations and tried to undercut their competition. But it was all moot anyway, because in 1935, in Schechter Poultry versus the United States, also known as the sick chicken case, the Supreme Court ruled that the NRA was unconstitutional because Congress was wage and price setting. They also said that those fair codes of competition were illegal because it was giving the president too much power, that had to deal with interstate commerce, which was left up to Congress to deal with. But aside from creating the NRA, the NIRA, that piece of legislation, also created the Public Works Administration, or the PWA. The focus here is on big projects, building dams, building locks, etc., to once again put men back to work, but also create hydroelectric power, to create irrigation, etc., to help the economy get going. Here you see that Blue Eagle, and here you see a WPA project working on a river lock on the Mississippi River. Now, as we've talked about before, it's very rough to be a farmer in the United States, especially during the Great Depression. Farmers face a lot of problems that most regular people don't. Remember, farmers, if they want to make more money, are forced pretty much to grow more and more and more products. This overproduction of farm products is only driving prices down and thus resulting in a lot of farm foreclosures during the 1930s. So, to give farmers some relief, Congress passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, to give subsidies to farmers to grow less. So basically what they were doing was that if you are a farmer and you agree to cut back on the acreage that you were willing to grow, you would get extra money from the federal government. It's creating artificial scarcity. Or if you are a farmer in livestock, you would be paid money to slaughter your extra livestock and just throw it in a ditch. Thousands of cows, pigs, sheep, goat, etc. were slaughtered and literally just thrown away to create this artificial scarcity. Now, as you can imagine, this created instant criticism against this act because here are people starving to death in America at this time, and we're literally throwing food away or paying our farmers not to grow as much stuff. But they felt that this was a necessary thing so that farmers could stay on their feet. But in 1936, in U.S. versus Butler, once again, the Supreme Court ruled that the AAA was unconstitutional because the way that they funded the AAA, they were taxing farm product producers. So if you were a flour mill, for example, you would have a higher tax put on you so that they could pay the other farmers to cut back on their stuff. They felt that this was coercive or forceful for the U.S. government to be doing. But nonetheless, Congress then moved on to focus on the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act. The idea here is to pay farmers to either leave their fields fallow, which means don't grow anything that year, or to produce or to grow soil-conserving crops in order to stop some of the erosion that was going on. And then last but not least, in 1938, Congress passed the Second Agricultural Adjustment Act to give farmers parity prices for what they were making back in 1918. So saying if you made X amount of dollars on your agricultural product in 1918, we are going to guarantee that price today. And obviously we remember World War I was the high point for farmers to be making money at this time.